In just 2 short months, American industry has been hit by a major shock that has rippled across the nation. More than 300 factories, from long-established industrial states in the Midwest to manufacturing hubs along the East Coast, suddenly lost all their supply contracts with Canada. A market that for decades had been seen as stable, friendly, and reliable for U.S. goods has now slammed its doors shut overnight. Orders that once moved smoothly, crossing the border on a steady rhythm, have been cancelled en masse, not because American factories were less productive or uncompetitive, but because Canada has deliberately redrawn its supply chain map. This time, American producers are no longer a priority. The shift stems from a series of trade agreements Ottawa has signed with the European Union, Asia, and South America, opening the door to new suppliers who offer lower costs, more flexible standards, and, crucially, far less political risk. The consequences are stark. U.S. businesses are being edged out of supply networks, regardless of their once dominant role in trade with Canada. With Canada accounting for nearly 15% of American industrial exports, this blow strikes not only at commerce, but at jobs. Tens of thousands of workers now face the prospect of reduced hours, temporary layoffs, or even outright plant closures. Factory towns are suddenly thrown into uncertainty. As their primary sources of income vanish overnight, the risk of localized economic recessions looms large. This is no mere trade misstep. It is a serious warning. Canadian Bulletin will take you deeper into the analysis. At the heart of the issue lies Canada's comprehensive restructuring of its supply chains, and the United States is no longer part of that plan. For decades, Canada and the United States have shared a tightly woven trade relationship, particularly in manufacturing. Not only has the U.S. been Canada's leading export partner, it has also served as a critical supplier for sectors ranging from automobiles and machinery to metal materials. Goods from factories across the border once flowed into Canada at a steady pace, forming an indispensable part of our industrial operations. But times have shifted quickly. In just a few months, Ottawa unveiled an ambitious plan, the National Supply Chain Restructuring Strategy, designed to lessen dependence on U.S. imports, increasingly seen as unreliable due to ongoing trade tensions and prolonged political volatility. The objective of the plan is crystal clear: to diversify supply sources from different regions across the globe in order to keep prices competitive and safeguard long-term supply chain security. At the same time, the government is strengthening protections for domestic production by prioritizing contracts for factories in Canada as well as newly established strategic partners. Behind this decision lies a decade of reflection. Over the past 10 years, successive administrations in Washington have repeatedly imposed tariffs or erected trade barriers against Canadian goods, from lumber and dairy to automobiles and steel. This has forced us to ask, is relying on the United States still a safe option? Especially when production costs in the U.S., including labor, health insurance, corporate taxes, and energy, are significantly higher than those of many partners in Europe or Asia. Moreover, every change in the White House brings unpredictable adjustments to trade policy between the two countries. For Canadian businesses that require long-term stability to plan investments and supply operations, this represents a serious risk. Rather than remaining reactive, Canada is now steadily removing the U.S. from its national supply chain map by proactively signing new trade agreements. Specifically with Europe, we are boosting imports of heavy industrial equipment, advanced production technologies, and mining machinery from Germany, Italy, and France. From Asian countries such as Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam, Canada is sourcing auto parts, electronic components, and mechanical products at prices up to 20% lower than those from the US. Meanwhile, South America has emerged as a supplier of raw and semi-finished metals at far more competitive rates. At the same time, technical barriers to US goods are being tightened. New regulations on origin, production processes, and detailed technical documentation requirements are creating significant challenges for American companies, many of which had grown accustomed to looser procedures in the past. Domestically, the government is accelerating investment in Canadian factories and encouraging businesses to choose local suppliers instead of relying on imports from the U.S. The impact has been immediate. Within just 60 days, supply contracts worth tens of millions of dollars with U.S. companies have been shortened or left unrenewed. Plants that once depended on steady orders from the north are now struggling, almost unable to pivot quickly enough to secure alternative markets. Some industries are bearing the brunt of these changes. Canada's restructuring of its entire supply chain and the removal of the US from a priority position is not merely a shift in partnership. It is, in effect, a direct hit to sectors deeply reliant on northern demand. For years, Canada imported large volumes of machinery, engines, and components from America's industrial states, such as Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Many auto assembly plants in Ontario once relied almost entirely on this supply chain. Now, orders for components and replacement parts have been reduced or redirected to new partners such as Japan, South Korea, and Germany. To date, more than 70 U.S. metalworking and auto parts manufacturers have reported revenue drops of 30 to 50% within just the past 2 months. Some smaller facilities have even begun implementing rotating worker furloughs, as there are not enough orders to maintain steady production. For decades, Canada has been one of the largest markets for U.S. steel and metals, particularly from states such as Pennsylvania and Illinois. Yet now, numerous contracts for sheet steel, construction steel, and industrial aluminium have been cancelled, replaced instead by supply from the European Union and South America, where prices are considerably lower. The result is that domestic U.S. steel prices have dropped by as much as 15% due to ballooning inventories, placing mounting pressure on the entire metallurgical sector. Many steel mills in the Rust Belt have been forced to cut shifts, directly affecting the livelihoods of thousands of local workers. The situation is no better in the lumber and furniture industries. The U.S. has long been the primary exporter of sawn timber, plywood, and furniture for Canada's construction and consumer markets. However, American supply is now steadily being replaced by Nordic timber, Russian wood, and low-cost furniture from Southeast Asia. Wood processing plants in North Carolina, Washington, and Oregon have already cut output by 20 to 40%. As a consequence, workers in the furniture sector are facing job losses or wage cuts, while communities that depend on forestry are beginning to feel clear signs of economic decline. A similar situation is unfolding in the machinery and equipment sector. Canada once imported large volumes of mining machinery, agricultural equipment, and food processing systems from the US. Now, however, many major contracts have been shifted to partners from Europe, such as Germany and Italy, or from Japan. American manufacturers of tractors, harvesters, and processing machinery have lost between 25 and 35% of their total export revenues to Canada. For small and medium-sized firms in this sector, that has meant scaling back operations, with some even suspending activity altogether due to the loss of market access. The processed food and beverage industry has not been spared either. Canada was once a stable consumer market for goods such as canned food, soft drinks, and processed products from the US. Today, however, new technical standards require suppliers to undergo additional inspections and certifications, raising costs by 15 to 20%. As a result, Canadian retail chains are shifting to imports from Europe and Australia, while simultaneously promoting domestic products. US food plants, in turn, are being forced to scale down production, creating a ripple effect that impacts both factory workers and American farmers supplying raw ingredients. Canada's adjustment of its import strategy is affecting not just individual industries, but triggering a widespread chain reaction. When export contracts are cancelled, American production lines slow down, leading to layoffs. Domestic raw material suppliers lose their outlets. Related service sectors such as transportation, warehousing, and equipment maintenance are also falling into stagnation. Within just 2 months, hundreds of industrial communities across the United States have begun to feel the mounting economic pressure, and if this situation persists, the consequences will extend far beyond the loss of Canadian customers, potentially shaking the foundations of an export-dependent industrial base. The ripple effects from the factories are spreading throughout entire communities. The loss of more than 300 supply contracts with Canada is not just a figure on trade documents. It represents a chain reaction directly impacting production and people's livelihoods. Many factories have been forced to scale back operations. With orders drying up, production lines have had to cut capacity, in some cases slashing output by 30 to 60%. Some facilities have even shut down completely, unable to cover operating costs in the face of severe shortages of demand. Revenues have plummeted, piling financial pressure on plants that still need to pay insurance, maintenance fees, and bank interest, but no longer have steady cash flow. The most immediate consequence is job losses. Work has been cut back, shifts reduced, and many workers placed on rotating furloughs or handed termination notices. For countless families, this was their primary source of income. When wages suddenly vanish, they can no longer afford rent, utilities, or other basic expenses. Workers are forced to tighten their spending, which immediately hits local businesses, from shops and auto repair garages to restaurants, all of which depend on household consumption. Farmers and component suppliers are also caught in the fallout. As processing plants scale down, their suppliers, from agricultural producers to parts manufacturers, lose their outlets as well. They are left with little choice but to reduce production or sell at lower prices to avoid even greater losses. Small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly those in packaging, accessories, and auxiliary equipment, key links in the supply chain, are now struggling after losing major contracts. Many are facing the threat of shutting down or declaring bankruptcy. The transport and logistics sector has been hit hard too. Trucks and trains sit idle with no goods to move into Canada. With shipments down, many drivers are seeing their wages cut or are being placed on temporary leave. At the same time, demand for housing, both rental and purchase, has plunged. As factories close or scale back, income and corporate tax revenues shrink, leaving local budgets under strain. This directly undermines public services and municipal investment capacity. Uncertainty has forced many other businesses to shelve investment or expansion plans, further weakening the drive for recovery. Population patterns are also shifting. Many people are leaving their hometowns to seek jobs elsewhere, reducing the local labor pool. In short, the loss of export contracts has not only paralyzed production lines, but has triggered a cascading breakdown, from manufacturing and employment to transport, and ultimately the survival of entire local economies. The prospect of permanently losing the Canadian market has become a tangible concern. Many American firms still cling to the hope that these lost orders are only temporary, that once trade tensions ease, business will return to normal. Yet the reality suggests otherwise. The risk of losing their foothold in Canada is becoming more pronounced, driven by both strategic choices and economic pressures. First, Canada has now secured stable alternative supply sources elsewhere. In a remarkably short time, both government and businesses have expanded import relationships with partners such as the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and several Southeast Asian nations. These suppliers not only offer more competitive prices, but also better meet the new technical standards set by Canada. Once supply chains have been restructured, returning to cooperation with American suppliers becomes highly complex and costly. Canadian businesses have already invested in adapting to new processes, contracts, and logistics. Reversing that course would be like starting from scratch. In other words, the US is no longer the default option it once was.